Welcome one and all to our Bible studies as we continue to join the dots to see how the prophetic word relates to us and how we can actually work things out by adhering to the word and getting to understand and know what the Lord is saying and what he has said in the past and how it's come to fruition. So this evening, I'm going to ask Sister Jackie to read for us from Luke chapter 19. Now, Luke chapter 19 is about a man called Zacchaeus. And what I want you to do is to have a read for me the first 10 verses. And then after that, I want to show us a film, actually. That's why I wanted folks to come early, about what's relevant to this subject matter. So let's read Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Let's read.
Okay. Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through to the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road. Well, Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. Zacchaeus, he said, "Quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today." Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. "He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner," they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus took before the Lord and said, "I will give half my wealth to the poor. Lord, if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much." Jesus responded, "Salvation come to this house today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to speak and save those who lost."
Amen.
Who are lost, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. So the Son of Man came to seek and to save those who are lost. And right here in this, what we've been talking about over the weeks in terms of joining the dots, we've been talking about the prophecies and how they're being fulfilled. We've looked at the numbers and how to calculate them. And we've determined, or we've learned, that when Jesus said in Luke 21, which is a few chapters up ahead, he said that the temple would be destroyed. There wouldn't be one stone standing in a time to come. I don't know if people didn't believe him. And he also said, when you see the abomination in Matthew 24 and verse 15, when you see the abomination that standing in the holy place, it's time to get out of Jerusalem because terrible things are going to happen. And with this period of time that we're living in, we've identified that the temple, the second temple of that was built in Jerusalem, that was built when the Hebrews or the Jews were allowed to come back just before Nehemiah came back. That temple that was built, it was destroyed in AD 70. And so these are historic facts, I'm telling you. And so Jesus goes on to say, when you see the the desolation spoken of by Daniel, standing in the holy place, get out of Jerusalem. And so just 37 years after Jesus' crucifixion, his rising from the death and his ascension, the temple was destroyed, and people weren't no more able to do animal sacrificing. And then we also learned that the times of tribulation that Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24, we also learned that is the relevant slave trades that's happened. And the slave trade was started by the Arabs who conquered Jerusalem in 638, and then carried on by the European nations who made it into an industry. And what we've read here in Luke 19 is a passage about someone who's encountered Jesus, and after he encountered Jesus, that's Zacchaeus. The Bible says he was small in stature. That means he was a short man, but he was a tax collector. And he made a lot of money because he profited of people's misery. And when he met Jesus, and Jesus came to his house for dinner, Zacchaeus said, I will make reparation. Look, but if I've taken stuff from folks, I will give them up to 4 times. Okay? And so Zacchaeus here is talking about reparation. And so if the countries who participated in the transatlantic slave trade, in the Arab slave trade, in the Barbary slave trade, in there's quite a few slave trades, in the Red Sea slave trade, in the Indian Ocean slave trade, and also by the Ottoman. If they are serious about meeting Jesus, when they meet Jesus, that should be their mantra. If we have defrauded anyone, if we've taken anything from them, then we will repay them. So I want you to realize that the Christianity that we are pursuing, the Christianity that we are following, the Jesus that we are following, is one about justice. Jesus is about justice. Jesus is about righteousness. And so when injustice occurs, Jesus wants to stand beside those who've been hurt and say, no, you folks who perpetrated it, you need to make it right. And so this evening, I want us to watch a little film. It's about 45 minutes long. It's about the empire paying back. And try and, jot down a few notes about it and then see how we go from there. Okay? It's really it's made by a very good friend of mine, Professor Robert Beckford, and it really highlights some of the things that we should be aware of, that our faith is not based in a vacuum. Our faith has consequences, just like Zacchaeus when he was caught, when he met Jesus, rather, not when he was caught. His first attitude was, in that short passage, now, if I've actually defrauded anyone, he says, and he knew that he had, I'm going to give up to half my possession. That's 50% I will give to the poor. And if I defrauded anyone anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. So watch this.
They were forced onto ships and transported as cargo across the ocean to a foreign land and made to work as slaves and ripped them away from their homes. They were forced onto ships and transported as cargo across the ocean to a foreign land and made to work as slaves. For hundreds of years, their blood and sweat helped to create a very, very rich empire. Slavery was finally done away with, but the empire kept its riches and has never paid its debt to the slaves.
The empire is Britain and the slaves Africa.
Africans taken to the Caribbean, just like my own ancestors. The debt has been ignored for over 200 years, but now I think it's time the empire pays back. My name's Robert Beckford. I'm a lecturer in the School of Historical Studies at the University of Birmingham. I believe African slaves were ripped off by the British Empire. I want to know who bankrolled it, who insured it, and who made a mint from it. I've even hired a group of boffins to do some number crunching so I know exactly how much is owed. I'm going to track down some heirs to Britain's slave past and ask them to pay reparations for the slave trade. To me, there's no doubt that we African Caribbeans are owed for our unpaid labour. The Jews have been compensated for the Holocaust, so why can't we be for what I believe was a black Holocaust? But how will the great British public respond to this suggestion?
It looks like this country is in permanent marriage.
I decide to boldly go and test out my ideas on a live radio phone-in in the nation's capital.
See you. Good to see you. Cheers. Robert, what's the idea behind this reparation? Because people will be raging at their radio right now.
It put it simply, when wrong is done in the past, in order to live a more healthy existence in the present and the future, you have to say sorry. The reparations movement is fundamentally about saying sorry for the slave trade, making amends for it through financial compensation so that we can move forward together positively.
Hello there, you ready to go on there and have a quick chat to Nick?
Adrian's in Sutton. What do you say, Adrian?
Hello, Nick.
Yes, mate.
Okay.
Dr. Robert there, he's living in Cloud Cuckoo Land, isn't he?
Why?
Well, who's going to pay for this?
If it is a way of soothing what are undoubtedly problems in this country, why is it not the way to go forward?
That being the case, so the French have got to do the same for Trafalgar and Waterloo, and the Spanish have got to do the same for the Armada.
Peter, should we apologise? Should we pay money?
No, not in a million years. It was a business partnership that was quite amicable between the Africans and the Europeans.
John's in Brentwood. Good morning, John.
Morning.
You support this or not?
Absolutely not. I think the man's going to cause more racial hatred in this country, and I don't apologise for anything because I'm not guilty of anything. It certainly shouldn't come out of taxpayers' money because I shouldn't pay a penny.
Robert, say you're a black fellow or a black woman waking up in London today, right? Do you honestly think you give a stuff about slavery?
Definitely, because
Why?
the impact is still with us. The major export from the slave trade was racism. If you're a black man or black woman waking up in London this morning,
mate, it's only in the mind of people like you.
Reality.
It's only in the mind of people like you. There will be tens of thousands of black folk listening to this programme right now who will be getting up and they will be going off to do whatever they do. They'll be going to their schools, they'll be going to their colleges, they'll be going to their places of work. They don't even know what the slave trade is, and it's because you bang on and on about it that they suddenly, oh my God, I've got to worry about it.
That was a really interesting experience. It just demonstrates that there's a great deal of post-colonial shock hitting this nation. The fact that people are in denial about the past, somebody telling me that they're not responsible, their son's not responsible, they don't understand how the past impacts the present. Also seems to me that there's a great deal of repression and anger and that people don't know how to deal with this history. I bet a lot of you right now are agreeing with the callers on the radio, but I'm going to convince you otherwise. I start by going to Liverpool, a city that was built on the profits from slavery. I'm on the famous ferry across the Mersey, but in the 18th century, this was the perfect port for slave trading and the gateway to Africa and the New World. Here's how it worked. Goods were taken from here to Africa, where they were traded for slaves. The slaves were then taken to the Caribbean to work on the plantations. And finally, the fruit of their labour, the tobacco, rum and sugar, were loaded up and brought back to Britain. It was a brilliant money spinner and had a knock-on effect for the rest of the city, from the people who built the ships to the people who sold the shackles. It turned a sleepy backwater into Europe's leading port. I bet you didn't know that by the 1780s, it was Liverpool ships that took 3 out of every 4 slaves from Africa to Jamaica. The journey from West Africa to the Caribbean was termed the Middle Passage. For the slaves, it was like a concentration camp on water. 1.5 million Africans never survived the Middle Passage, and they were the lucky ones. On the plantations, the slaves were literally worked to death. As many as 1 in 5 dropped dead in the first year. Liverpool got stinking rich off the back of the slave trade, but there's not one significant monument to the slaves suffering in the city.
Here we have 2 slaves.
But there is one man who wants his fellow Liverpudlians to confront the city's shameful past.
They would be packed like sardines if you imagine that this is a bunk bed.
Mr. Lynch is an amateur historian. I catch up with him as he takes a group of kids on a slavery tour of their hometown.
If you go and trace the history of the banks, you'll find they were involved in the slave trade.
The tour ends up at the old Martin's Bank building in the city's centre, which actually glorifies the riches that came from slavery.
Neptune is standing with his hand on the heads of the 2 African children. Around their ankles and around their wrists, they wear shackles. You do not need me to tell you they are slave children standing on the deck of a slave ship. This is the arrogance of power.
I knew Liverpool had a history of slavery, but I never thought I'd see slaves depicted on the side of a bank there. Every day, African Caribbeans in Britain experience the economic legacy of slavery. African Caribbean men are more than twice as likely to be unemployed as white men. Black workers earn up to 16% less than whites. And more African Caribbean men enter prison than university. To me, black people are still paying for slavery and should be compensated. But some people just don't get it.
The standard of living of the descendants of slavery is many times that of those left in Africa.
That's the slavery there, but not as we know it, be the Afro-Caribbean.
All taken at random, by the way. There's not one supporting Dr. Beckford's assertion. These are all just taken out as they come in.
People just don't want to know. So it's going to be a struggle, but I'm going to convince them that Britain should pay up. Along the way, I'm going to make some harrowing discoveries about my own family history. Hey, check this out. Here's another slave that he's selling.
Reverend Jackson, pleased to meet you.
I'm going to bring in some big guns to my cause. And these guys are going to work out the bill Britain faces for the unpaid labour of her slaves.
That sounds like a lot. Are you sure?
We Brits don't like talking about money, and we certainly don't like talking about the pots of money we made from slavery. That would be bad manners. But to hell with it. I'm determined to find some of those who made a mint out of slavery. And this is where it gets personal. I've come to Beckford's Tower in Bath, but it's not named after my family, but rather the slave masters who once owned my family. The tower was built by William Beckford in 1827, who inherited a fortune from his dad. Back in the day, Beckford Jr. was one of the wealthiest men in Britain, and almost every last penny of it was made off the backs of slaves.
How did the Beckfords make this huge fortune?
When it's talked about and when we do tours here at the museum, we always sort of like to say, well, the money came from sugar plantations in Jamaica, which is a very polite way of saying that it came from the slave trade.
So how many slaves did he have?
We think at the peak of the Beckford estates, when they had around 22 estates in Jamaica, it was around 1,200 slaves.
Do you know much about that relationship, how the Beckfords gave the slaves their name?
Because the Beckfords were the biggest plantation owners in Jamaica and the wealthiest plantation owners in Jamaica, there's probably no doubt that that's how the name descended, that it was your descendants having been given the Beckford family name.
Given the name isn't an act of benevolence, it's basically an act of branding, of ownership, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's almost saying that that's our possession, basically.
You may find it hard to believe, but when slavery was abolished in 1834, the government put up £20 million to compensate slave owners like the Beckfords for the loss of their slaves. That's the equivalent of almost £2 billion today. The slaves got nothing. I follow the Beckford Trail of Wealth to the capital, to the Guildhall in the City of London. Here, I discover how slave owners use the family blood money to buy their place in history.
I came to the Guildhall to do some research and I stumbled across this. It's a statue of William Beckford. He was twice Lord Mayor of London in the 18th century. They called him a West Indian planter. Now, he never planted anything in his life. He got his slaves to do it. And those slaves were my ancestors. Now, he was able to turn that economic power into political power, and he's celebrated for it. But the slaves, the men, women, and children who did the work, they've been forgotten.
In the Guildhall Library, I comb the Beckford archives and make a chilling discovery.
It concerns William Beckford, the younger, the son of the dude we saw in the Guildhall, and he's selling slaves. This is the deed of sale to show that it's like a receipt, really, that he's selling these slaves. And it's dated the 31st of December, 1823. So although the slave trade has ended, slavery is still taking place on the plantations of the Caribbean. And there are slaves with the same surname as me. And hey, check this out. Here's another slave that he's selling. Robert Beckford. Black. 25 years of age. This guy's a Creole. I feel quite numb because although these are names on a page, I know that they're real people, and there's a good chance that I may be related to some of these people, or some of these people actually met some of my ancestors.
So let me get this right. The Beckford family slave owners received compensation from the British government, but the Beckford slaves received nothing. Was there any hope of getting justice here? The British weren't the only empire to profit from slave labour. The Nazis also did a bit of slaving. I head straight to Germany to find out whether the Germans have paid for their past crimes. Right in the centre of Berlin, I find a vast monument commemorating the murder of Jews in Europe. During World War II, over 3.5 million people were enslaved by the Nazis. Most of them were Jewish, and they were literally worked to death. 60 years later, the German state and industry paid over £3 billion in financial reparations to the surviving slave labourers and some of their descendants.
There's absolutely nothing of this size or scale within Britain commemorating the Black Holocaust, slavery. And I think if we had something like this, it would go a long way towards healing the wounds of the past and enabling us to live much more civilly in the present. Not only has Germany erected a fantastic and significant monument, but they've also put their money where their mouth is and made it clear that you can't get away with slavery.
Why was the German wartime experience of slavery any different to that of African Caribbeans who worked for the British Empire? I tracked down one of the lawyers who has won compensation in the German case and get some free legal advice from Bert Newborn.
With your experience of the German case of forced labour during the war, do you feel I have a case?
Well, there's no doubt that the case for African slavery is as strong as the case that we had here. The problem isn't theory. As a matter of theory, both groups should receive the same compensation. The problem is timing. If this had been done within 50 years of the abolition of slavery, if it had been done within a time frame where the individuals were still alive, I think they could and should have received compensation.
I've come back to Britain encouraged by what I've learnt in Germany. We have a case, and there's a precedent for companies and governments compensating people for slavery. The big problem is that we're about 150 years too late in filing our claim. But the German experience sets me thinking. If I could prove British companies had links with slavery, would they cough up? It's very hard to get anyone in the corporate world to talk about this, but one man is brave enough. Rodney Leach, director of the Jardine Matheson Group. They don't have links to slavery, but began as a shipping company in the 1830s. I ask him whether British companies should follow the German example.
I think Germany has behaved extremely well in atoning for its role in the war, impeccably. But you can't visit the sins of the fathers on the sons. Well, even more so, you can't visit the sins of very, very remote generations 200 years ago, where there's been a complete discontinuity of families, of employees, of obligations to others. And in the case of slavery, you've got the added dimension that morality is inferred. I think Germany has behaved extremely well in atoning for its role in the war, impeccably. But you can't visit the sins of the fathers on the sons. Well, even more so, you can't visit the sins of very, very remote generations 200 years ago, where there's been a complete discontinuity of families, of employees, of obligations to others. And in the case of slavery, you've got the added dimension that morality has moved and changed on. It was part of society.
And you wouldn't ask them to apologise for this past?
No, I think you can apologise for your own actions and not for somebody else's. If you marry into my family, I'm not going to ask you to apologise for what my grandfather did, who you've never heard of. As far as I know, he lived a blameless life. But no, I don't think that's right. I think that's actually fake sentimentality. The only form of proper apology you can make is living your own life well.
I leave feeling discouraged. Sounds like British companies would be pretty hostile to the idea of paying reparations for slavery. And unlike the recent German case, it's all happened so long ago that it would be hard to get people really fired up about the idea. Then, while I'm making this film, a big story breaks in America which changed everything.
From now on, as JP Morgan Chase Bank One customers transact business, they'll do so with the full knowledge that their financial institution is linked to the slave trade.
JP Morgan Chase discovered that two of its predecessor banks had taken ownership of over 1,000 slaves as collateral on loans in the mid-1800s. The bank apologized and set up a $5 million college tuition scholarship fund for African American students.
Unjust institution.
I can't believe what I'm hearing. It's the first time reparations have ever been paid for victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Soon after I hear the news, I discover that the creme de la creme of the black business world are in the City of London for a big event with the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who's visiting from America. What would the business community have to say about British banks and companies paying reparations?
Why should we not receive something for the suffering that we had? Why should we not?
I do think it's important, but I think it's to our benefit that we move on, that we don't live in the past.
Reparations is a very complex issue. I mean, if money is repaid, where does it go? What does it do?
It is good, but you cannot quantify the cost of slavery. It is not possible.
I wait until the end and managed to get a word with the man himself and got his take on the hot topic of reparations.
There must be repay for damage done. Repair for damage done. It's not a foreign concept. I mean, Israel is a state of reparations for damage done, justifiably so. The Africans, victims of the slave trade, we must demand repay for damage done. It may take many forms, but the concept is legitimate and the need is great.
Do you think that British banks, British institutions should follow what JP Morgan Chase have done and repair the past by paying reparation?
Any company that had connection with the slave trade had to make its record public. And so there must be public pressure to make the records public, because they deny and lie about the slave connection. But the fact is it's there, and so there must be public pressure here to open the records.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Thank you.
what Jesse Jackson said is really important. There's a man who's been at the forefront of the civil rights movement arguing that reparations is a must. It has to be paid in order to heal the wounds of the past and move a nation forward. If it's good enough for Jesse Jackson, then it has to be good enough for the UK. My case for reparations is picking up speed. I've now got a precedent for a company compensating people for slavery, even if it occurred over a century ago. And I've got Brother Jesse on my side. So my next question is the big one. How much are we in Britain owed? No one has ever dared to calculate Britain's debt to its former slaves. I'm no expert in these matters, so I tracked down the country's top specialists and asked them if, for the first time ever, they could come up with a figure for reparations. 3 men rise to the challenge.
In agriculture.
David Richardson is an economic historian and authority on the slave trade in Britain.
We might talk perhaps about 20 years of employment at £10 a year.
Peter Tompkins is an actuary, an expert witness in loss of earnings cases.
Do you deduct from that the value?
And Mick Antoniv is one of the leading lawyers in the field of workers' compensation. The team decide that the first figure they should look at is compensation for unpaid labour.
I want to know, how do we calculate the cost of unpaid labour?
The agricultural wage rate in England was about £1 a day.
If I were a slave, I would be being fed and housed, obviously, to keep me able to work. But if I'd been paid, I'd have had to pay for my board and lodging in order to keep myself satisfied.
The team decide that if a slave was paid the going rate of £10 a year, after deducting cost of living expenses, this comes to £200 in earnings for a lifetime of slavery.
And don't forget, in the 18th century, agricultural...
But Peter explains that with compensation, compound interest applies to make up for what you would have earned on the money.
You're probably looking at £200 then, growing to about £1 million today.
So, that £200 that each slave wasn't paid is subject to compound interest, and that gives us a figure of £1 million in lost wages for every slave.
But that's just for one person.
Yes.
So, how many people are we talking about?
What we do know are, first of all, the numbers of enslaved Africans who were transported to the Americas on British ships. Perhaps 500,000 of those died before they reached America. Are we including those?
I think what you're talking about, those that survived.
Those that survived, fine. So we're talking about then...
About 3 million is around.
We're talking around 2.9 million, 3 million people.
So that's 3 million Africans taken to work as slaves for the British Empire. Another million were born into slavery, which gives us 4 million slaves from the late 1600s to the end of the slave trade in 1807. So to calculate the unpaid wages, we take 4 million slaves times £1 million each in lost earnings, and this comes out to a tidy £4 trillion. The unpaid wages alone at £4 trillion is mind-boggling, and the team say that's just the beginning. So my next question is, who gets the bill? I decide it's time to go and pull some slave skeletons out of the closet and do some naming and shaming. And over on my left, we have the famous financiers of the slave trade. And I'm even going to take my case all the way to the Queen. I've got a bill for £4 trillion in my pocket for the cost of the unpaid wages of Britain's slaves. Now I'm going to find out who should start paying. Not many people know this, but the clues as to who benefited from slavery are hidden in some of our nation's favourite landmarks. All aboard, welcome to the Robert Beckford Alternative Tour of London. This is the Tour of Shame. Here we have the National Gallery, founded on a collection of paintings owned by John Julius Angerstein, but he was also the owner of a slave plantation. And over on my left, we have the famous financiers of the slave trade, the Bank of England. And just
behind me is Lloyd's of London, the insurers of slaves. And here at Canary Wharf, we have Barclays and HSBC, both of which have slavery in their family trees. And of course, the Houses of Parliament. By 1766, over 40 MPs were either slave traders or plantation owners. Slavery was such good business for the empire that it was sanctioned at the highest levels of power. The Church of England managed to swallow its Christian principles and own a plantation with over 300 slaves in the early 1700s. They even had their own brand. The head of state was in on it too. Back in the day, slavery was given the royal seal of approval. Queen Elizabeth I funded one of the first slave voyages in 1563. Later, Charles II gave the Royal African Company a monopoly on slave trading, and many of the first investors were members of the royal family. Today, despite people insisting, the royal family has never given an apology for this terrible, dark, ugly stain on its family history. I find it very odd that the Queen has never been encouraged to apologise for slavery. It's not like she never says sorry. Look at her go here. In 1995, as head of state, she put on a Kiwi feather cape and apologised to the Maori people for the fact that the British Crown had violated a land treaty over 150 years ago. I decided to track down Her Majesty and found out that she was attending a charity event at, of all places, Lloyd's of London, the former insurers of slaves. Now, I brought her these flowers and this royal charter to remind her of the fact that 300 years ago, one of her predecessors signed this document and it put the wheels of slavery in motion. Now, I know we can't hold the Queen personally responsible for what took place 300 years ago, and I've got nothing against the Queen. I like the Queen. But I was hoping to gently remind her of her family history. There's quite a large police presence, and I don't think she's going to be accepting flowers. In the end, it's up to the government to instruct the Queen to apologise. So she didn't get the flowers, but maybe one day someone will tell her to do the decent thing. I didn't get very far with the Queen, not much surprise there, but I'm determined to challenge some of the other institutions with slavery in their past. I'm taking on some big organisations and I want to get my facts straight to understand exactly how the tentacles of slavery reach all the way to your high street. HSBC may stand for Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, but this bank has slavery in its family tree. Back in Liverpool, there's this guy, Thomas Leyland. He's a slave trader and sends over 3,500 to Jamaica alone. He makes a fortune from the trade and establishes a bank with his nephew. Leyland and Bullins Bank is eventually taken over by North and South Wales Bank in 1901. That becomes a part of Midlands Bank. And as we know, in recent history, Midlands was taken over by HSBC. Barclays finally sealed its link to the slave trade in 1969 when it acquired Martin's Bank. Now the link comes through Arthur Hayward. He made a mint through the slave trade and set up the Hayward Bank. The Hayward Bank was later acquired by the Bank of Liverpool, and the Bank of Liverpool merged with Martin's Bank, which is now owned by Barclays. Even the Bank of England has the shadow of slavery across it. Not only were several former governors actual slave owners, some of their most important customers were slave traders. They were even offered discounted loans and more favourable terms to finance their slave endeavours. I finally got the hard evidence I was looking for. Now I'm determined to get the first ever reparations from a UK institution with a slave past. We wrote to HSBC, Barclays and the Bank of England to ask them if they would apologise and pay up. None of these banks deny that they have slavery in their past,
but none of them wanted to be interviewed, and none of them would give me a straight answer when I asked about an apology and reparations. HSBC felt that the bank that they eventually took over never dealt directly with slaves, even though it was started by slave traders. So they feel that they only have an indirect link to slavery. They added that this history has no bearing on the culture and values of HSBC today. The Bank of England were very helpful. They gave us lots of information from their archives. They even said that the City of London was awash with slave money. But when I suggested that they put some of this information in their museum, they went very quiet. Barclays pointed out that their founder, David Barclay, was a Quaker and was involved in the abolition movement. So why don't they follow in the footsteps of their founder and acknowledge the role of slavery in their history? In my travels around the City of London, I've noticed that the financial institutions seem to love celebrating their rich history. So in this fine tradition, I decide to remind them of the dark side of their past. So far, it's some high street banks, the Bank of England, the Church and the royal family who I think owe a debt to the slaves. But they're not alone. The whole British financial system was intimately involved with the slave trade. Think of this the next time you sip on a cappuccino. The coffee and sugar produced by the slaves on the plantation gave birth in the late 17th century to the fashionable coffee houses. And it was in these that the slave traders and their merchants did their wheeler dealing. Shipping slaves was an incredibly profitable business. You could get really rich, but it was risky. So it was vital that you had insurance. So if you're a slave ship owner, you'd come to a place like this, order a cup of coffee, meet with a rich businessman and have him insure your ship and its cargo, slaves. It was the insurance business that made the slave trade both viable and profitable. If you think insurance was just about deals made in the coffee shops of London, let me tell you the story of the slave ship Zong. It set sail in 1781 from West Africa. A month into the journey, many of the slaves were sick and dying. You couldn't collect insurance if the slaves died of natural causes, so Captain Luke Collingwood concocted a story that his ship was running low on water. This gave him a valid reason to get rid of his cargo. Over the course of 3 days, 133 slaves were thrown overboard so that the owner could collect the insurance money. For me, the story of the Zong reveals how human beings, flesh and bones, were turned into commodities that could be easily disposed of. It just shows how brutal and how callous this trade really was. So who was profiting from this sick business of insuring slaves? I've come across some information on an institution that you'll be familiar with. It's Lloyd's of London. This is a history of Lloyd's from the 1920s, and within it, there's a policy document covering a slave ship. It's dated 1794, and the ship is leaving from Liverpool, going to Africa, and then to Cuba. Lloyd's have insured the ship for £3,500 and each slave for £45. It's here in black and white. It's clear evidence of Lloyd's of London's involvement in the slave trade. Historians reckon that by the mid-18th century, 90% of all marine insurance was handled by Lloyd's. Today, they're based here in the City of London and are one of the biggest insurance houses in the world. What I want to know is how much of the foundations of this snazzy building are down to the slave trade. I wrote to Lloyd's to ask them if I could visit their archives to find out the extent of their slave past. They declined my request and said they couldn't comment because of legal reasons. A group of slave descendants in America is currently suing them.
Lloyd says their case is without merit, but who knows, maybe one day Lloyd will have to do a JP Morgan and own up to a slave past. I've got as far as I can with naming and shaming, so I head back to my team of experts. They tell me that to work out the total amount owed as compensation for slavery, we need to put a figure on how much the British economy generally benefited from the labour of slaves in the Caribbean. Today's supermarkets and the products they sell have no connection with the slave trade. But back in the 18th century, sugar was the commodity which satisfied Britain's newfound sweet tooth and fattened the economy of the day. I meet up with historian Hilary Beckles, who told me why sugar was so important to the British Empire.
If the sugar industry, the British investor in the colonies had finally found a commodity that could generate the wealth they were looking for. But to produce the sugar required thousands and thousands of slaves. And to do that, you need shipping. To do that, you need insurance. You need financial institutions to come on board, the banks, the insurance companies. Sugar and slavery, in fact, constituted the yeast that allowed the British economy to rise in the 18th century. On the other hand, you have in the Caribbean millions of African peoples involved in a virtual genocidal situation.
That's heavy. That's heavy stuff. I mean, I've no thought about it in those terms.
It is cheaper to use up, to burn up, and replace an individual than to sustain and prolong their lives.
Britain got filthy rich from sugar during slavery days. So what was the genocide of millions of Africans worth to the British economy? The team are now coming up with a figure for what the lawyers call unjust enrichment.
We're talking about an industry which was adding something like £5 million a year to the British economy.
The sugar industry was worth £5 million annually at its height from the 17th century to the middle of the 18th century. So taking 100 years at 5 million, that comes to £500 million.
Grossing it for investment since then, and putting it in today's terms, you're talking about 2.5 trillion.
So with compound interest, that 500 million comes to a total of £2.5 trillion for the unjust enrichment from the sugar trade.
The UK economy today has a GDP of about £1.2 trillion, I think. And I think it would be unreasonable for me to suggest that the enrichment was twice the value of the economy today. I think that's not really realistic.
Well, except you're talking over a 100-year period, isn't it? So I mean, you're putting a global figure rather than taking 1 year now compared with 100 years of profit. So the figure isn't really that unrealistic when you put it in those terms.
But I want to raise a contentious point to put it into context.
Now, my family are from Jamaica. One of the questions that arises out of slavery in the Caribbean isn't just that the British brought us there, but also that the Africans sold us. Should we therefore be making a claim against Africans for unjust enrichment?
But most estimates that I've seen suggest that, on balance, Africa was a loser by the slave trade.
Well, that settles it for me. Africa's net gain from the slave trade equals 0. So far, the team has calculated the money owed by the British Empire for the unpaid wages and the unjust enrichment of the British sugar industry. But still to come is the figure for the human cost of the transatlantic slave trade. Then, I'm going to make sure that everyone knows about it.
I was just wondering if you could make out what that is.
It's auction day at the stables and business is brisk. It's hard to imagine that not long ago, Africans were bought and sold like animals.
with only 500 ice metal on top. Last time go around the ring. 5, 6, 600 bid. 600 Eagles 4.
But I suspect that these horses are treated better than the Africans who were enslaved by the British Empire. Taken from Africa, their bodies were branded with hot irons, and then their sores covered up with tar, and their bodies buffed up with oil to make them look healthier than they actually were. And then the final humiliation, paraded naked in front of their potential owners like prime livestock. I've heard a lot about the mechanics of the slave economy and the nuts and bolts of how this country built an empire on the backs of African slaves. But it's the human cost that stays with me. How can you put a price on that?
If you listen to the biographies of the enslaved themselves, they talk about the pain and suffering they experienced in being detached from their own family.
I asked the team how we could arrive at a figure to compensate the slaves for pain and suffering.
Perhaps looking at cases where there are miscarriages of justice, people who've been put into bondage in UK jails. And again, it's quite difficult to assess, but some cases have put around about £14,000 a year. So someone who's in slavery for 20 years, that would work out at a figure of around about £250,000 or so.
So being enslaved for 20 years at £12,500 a year compensation for wrongful imprisonment works out to £250,000 for each slave suffering. If you multiply that by 4 million slaves, that works out to £1 trillion. So the team have come up with this: £4 trillion in unpaid wages, £2.5 trillion for the unjust enrichment of the British economy through the profits of the sugar industry, and another £1 trillion for pain and suffering. The grand total of Britain's debt to its slaves comes to a massive £7.5 trillion. How do you respond to that?
The figure is very reasonable and realistic.
I think your most sensible hope is that it brings home the message that actually there is an economic legacy, and you address an economic legacy by trying to rectify things for future generations.
Thank you for your work on this. It's been very important and also momentous because it's the first time that anyone in the UK has come up with a figure.
Thank you, Herbert.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So the final figure of the debt to Britain's slaves is £7.5 trillion. £7.5 trillion. That's an incredible amount of money. Now, I'm not expecting all of that to be paid. It would bankrupt this country. And I personally am not looking for a cash handout, but it should be used as a measure of how much is owed in debt to the African sacrifice made in the plantations. I think that some of it should be paid back. It should go to wiping off debt in Africa. It should go to wiping off debt in the Caribbean and setting up educational projects that counter racism here in Britain. In comparison to what is really due, that's a drop in the ocean. Armed with my figure, I decide to take the argument for reparations to the very top. In the case of Germany, it was the government as well as German industry who paid compensation to the slaves. I want to know if the British government are prepared to cough up for their crime against humanity. I was told to go and talk to this woman, Fiona McTaggart. She was the Minister for Race Equality. I asked her whether Britain would pay financial reparations to its former slaves like Germany did.
At the time that Nazi Germany created slave labour camps and undertook the genocide, it was against international law. There was no doubt about that. It was illegal. They knew it was illegal. And they flouted the law. At the time that Britain was involved with the slave trade, that wasn't the case. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't wrong. It was wrong. But at the time, it wasn't illegal in the same way. So the same mechanism isn't appropriate.
I always get kind of irritated when people say, well, it was legal, so that means we can't therefore deal with...
I wasn't getting anywhere on the reparations, but maybe the government would at least issue an apology for the slave trade.
There is no doubt that Britain is profoundly sorry that this happened. And the ritual of an apology might help, but I don't think it's the most important thing. I think the most important thing, when something is broken, is to do what you can to fix it.
Hang on a minute, because in 1997, Tony Blair apologised for the Irish potato famine, which took place 150 years ago. Surely an apology in that situation should be matched by an apology in this situation.
I don't think we can compete about apologies. I think a better way of getting it right is to really practically show a determination in today and the future about where you're going, and to make absolutely certain, and this is something which I'm anxious about, that the lessons of that past are properly learned.
I've just come out of a meeting with Fiona McTaggart, and I really believe she just doesn't get the point. It seemed to me that there's an inability by herself and the government to look backwards and to recognise that you can't make sense of the present unless you look back. And for me, looking back on slavery demands an apology, and it also demands reparations. So we've got a debt worth £7.5 trillion, but nobody wants to know. And despite this huge sacrifice of the slaves, there's not a single monument to slavery in the capital. Although there are memorials to all sorts of other things, including, get this, the animals who served in war. This is just unacceptable. So I decide to take matters into my own hands and hatch a plan with my artist friend, Foakan.
Yeah, a while ago.
I ask him to create an image to commemorate the victims of the slave trade. Then we take to the streets to get the message out to as many people as possible. The plan is to project Foakan's artwork onto the side of a public building.
That's a projection, I think, and on a computer screen you can't get the full...
I really wanted to display this light memorial onto the Bank of England to reflect their and the City of London's own slave history. But the bank and the Corporation of London wouldn't let us because of security reasons. So in the end, we had to go instead for one of London's main tourist attractions, Covent Garden.
This is the image that the Bank of England and the City of London authorities didn't want to have beamed on the side of their building. They said it was a security threat. Now, it doesn't look like much of a threat to me, given the fact that we're owed £7.5 trillion in reparation. The least that they could do is provide a permanent monument to the memory of the Atlantic slave trade. You British?
I'm British, yeah.
You're British. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a good idea. Any recognition of anything that was hardship and stuff like that, I'm all for that.
What about putting it on the plinth in Trafalgar Square?
I mean, it's a pretty powerful impression with, I guess it's sugar cane at the bottom of the,
That's right,
of the
yeah.
picture, is it?
Who thought the sugar cane was asparagus?
Yeah.
Right. Do you think the idea of a permanent monument to slavery would be a good idea?
Definitely, yeah.
People try to forget about it, but it's sort
It's a part of our history, so it should be recognised and acknowledged.
The reactions of people to my temporary memorial show me that British people do have a sense of fair play and want justice done. Last night's live projection was a one-off, and it doesn't change the fact that Britain got rich from the slave trade and have got away with it. In 2007, we'll be commemorating the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade, and I can think of no better time for the government to acknowledge and pay its debt to the slaves. Mr. Blair, you're in charge. I want to know, isn't it now time that the empire pays back?
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for watching and for persisting with it.
that film, The Empire Plays Back, you can watch it at your leisure if you just search for it on YouTube. It's produced by a friend of mine. He was my teacher actually at university, Professor Robert Beckford, who calculated the debt of slavery. Now, we started our Bible studies by looking at Luke 19. So I'm going to ask Jackie to just come and read that again. And welcome to those who joined us after. And then we're going to talk about what we've been doing over this course and how that will play out in the real world. Because Christianity, our faith, does impact the real world. We're not just here to go together in churches and to clap our hands and pray and sing and go home and that's it. We're here to change the world. Jesus turned his world upside down. Yes, they crucified him, but he didn't stay dead. And he's given us the mandate to change our world. Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So let's conclude, and then you could ask questions. For those who joined later and didn't see the beginning of that Empire Pays Back, as I said, you can watch it on YouTube, or you can watch this recording where it was shown from the beginning. So Jackie, if you can just unmute and then come and read again for me from Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10, where it's a story about Zacchaeus. And if you read it, listen to it carefully, you will see that Zacchaeus, when he met Jesus, when he really met Jesus and Jesus came to his house, Zacchaeus is talking about reparation. Okay? Jackie, just read that for us, please.
Okay. Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by the name. Zacchaeus, he said, "Quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today." Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus took before the Lord and said, "I will give half my wealth to the poor. Lord, and if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give back 4 times as much." Jesus responded, "Salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man come to seek and save those who are lost."
Amen. Thank you so much, Sister Jackie. And so all of you who are here, remember that the Son of Man still has come to seek and to save those who are lost. And part of seeking and saving is to institute justice. Justice will only happen when we act in a way that is righteous, that is right in the sight of God. And that can only happen when we actually invite Jesus to come into our homes. As you notice in the film, all of the establishment was involved in the transatlantic slave trade and also in the other slave trade. You had the royal family, the bank, even the Church of England, the church and the royal families, I said, Lloyd's of London, the insurers, the shipbuilders, everywhere you turn, even the banks that we're banking with today, they all benefited from being part and parcel of the transatlantic slave trade. Remember, there were other slave trades as well, which Jesus spoke about. In Matthew 24, verse 15, Jesus says, when you see the abomination that Daniel spoke of standing in the holy place, run. And when these people ran, they ran into Africa, as we've been talking about for the weeks. And also a lot of them got caught up in the Arab slave trade or the trans-Saharan slave trade. And a lot more got caught up in the transatlantic slave trade, where they were shifted across the ocean in ships like sardines, as pointed out by Moses in Leviticus chapter 26 and also in Deuteronomy. So what we're seeing here, what we're doing, we are living in that time when the scriptures are being fulfilled. And there's a lot of people with different opinions about Revelations and so on. And there's a lot of people of futurists that say, oh, the tribulation period is going to come. But let me tell you, the slavery, the enslavement of people was the most brutal thing that has ever happened in the history of humanity. You saw a glimpse of that with the Holocaust, where the majority of Jews were forced to work in labor camps and they were killed. Those are European Jews. Those are Ashkenazi Jews in the main, okay? And that was a microcosm of the heinous acts that went on the plantation in the Caribbean, from where many of us are descended. And Jesus told us about that. He said, this thing here, if you read it in Matthew chapter 24 and also in Luke, you will see Jesus said, this will never happen again like it did. And he's talking about the Arab slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade, which was, if you watch the beginning of the film, it says 1/4 of the people who arrived on the plantation, within a year they died. And the majority who arrived, they were worked to death, and their life expectancy was about 7 years. And, as depicted in the book by Moses, in Leviticus and also in Deuteronomy. And so we have to be aware that what we're studying here relates to history. It relates to facts, okay? This is not just some pie in the sky, oh, the New Jerusalem is going to come down. Yes, it will, but there must be reparation before that. And so mark my word, as we go on to go towards the return of Jesus, these countries who've perpetrated these wickedness, like Zacchaeus, they will come to their right minds, and they will understand that not only is Jesus coming back again, but you cannot talk about Jesus without talking about justice. Jesus means justice. Jesus is for reconciliation. Jesus is for reparation. And it comes down to our own personal level as well. If we've had stuff against anyone, or anyone's done us stuff, once they call on the name of the Lord, once they encounter Jesus, like Zacchaeus, they must say, if I have defrauded anyone, look, up to half my possession I will give to the poor, and I will, if I defrauded them, I will repay them back 4 times what I've taken. The moral of that is, when you encounter Jesus, you must repair. You must repair a relationship, repair what you've done, give back what you've stolen. In Proverbs, it says, if a thief is caught, he must pay back 7 times what he's stolen. But you can only do that when you really and truly encounter Jesus. In our film, we call this the theology of embrace, where the victim and the perpetrator occupy the same space. And they've come to the idea that if I have hurt you, if I have taken away from you, I must return you to the good by making reparation. So reparation is a biblical mandate, and it's something that all of us as Christians need to do. I hope you enjoy the film. If you want to watch it again, as I said, I can put a link in the chat, or you can just go to YouTube and search for The Empire Pays Back. And in closing, let me say that film was made in 2005. That's 20 years ago. And the British government has failed to apologize properly for their part in the transatlantic slave trade, even though, as was pointed out in the film, all the institutions in London, in Liverpool, in Bristol. In Bristol, the cathedral has a stained glass window that's dedicated to a slaver. His name is Poulsen. Okay, you remember they pulled down his statue in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. And so these things are coming home to roost, and the government has to do something about it. Okay? And so thank you so much for all those who've joined us this evening. And I hope it was informative. If it wasn't, then please tell me. Okay? God bless you and see you again soon. Right, let me stop this recording.